3. Kierkegaard on himself. Preface: Søren Kierkegaard was born in Denmark in 1813 and died in 1855. Against the theoretical philosophy of Hegel and his predecessors, he pitted a mode of reflection closer to the individual's concrete existence. He tried to live his thoughts, at times grotesquely, as he pictures his own efforts in the point of view below, but at other times, especially at the end of his life, with a complete and utter disregard for his temporal welfare. He died having worn himself out with protests against the perversion of Christianity by Christian institutions and refusing the ministrations of his church. That he would have lived through the Hitler years like either of the leading German existentialists is unthinkable. When fortune smiled at him, he dared a powerful paper that had praised his work, but which he detested as a scandal sheet, to pillory him. It did. The selection on his mission is from the concluding unscientific postscript, page 164, ff. The work was published over a pseudonym like many of his books, but in this case the author added his own name as editor. Ostensibly, then, the I here is not Kierkegaard himself. In this selection, 3 dots mark minor omissions, but in the following selections, they are punctuation marks, which the author sometimes used in place of dashes. The selection on his works is the conclusion of Chapter 1, Part 2, in The Point of View, and sums up his discussion of his aesthetic works, the postscript, and the religious works. The next selection picks up where the second one ended. It is the beginning of Chapter 2. The final selection is from That Individual, 2 notes concerning my work as an author, which was published in 1859 posthumously, along with The Point of View. Of the first of the 2 notes, only the introductory page and the final footnote have been omitted. From the second note, only 1 paragraph has been used. Out of Kierkegaard's troubled prose, there gradually crystallize a few central motifs which are clearly continuous with notes from underground. On his mission. 1. It is now about 4 years ago that I got the notion of wanting to try my luck as an author. I remember it quite clearly. It was on a Sunday. Yes, that's it, a Sunday afternoon. I was seated, as usual, out of doors at the cafe in the Friedrichsburg garden. I had been a student for 60 years. Although never lazy, all my activity nevertheless was like a glittering inactivity, a kind of occupation for which I still have a great partiality, and for which perhaps I even have a little genius. I read much, spent the remainder of the day idling and thinking, or thinking and idling, but that was all it came to. So there I sat and smoked my cigar until I lapsed into thought. Among other thoughts I remember these. You are going on, I said to myself, to become an old man, without being anything, and without really undertaking to do anything. On the other hand, wherever you look about you, in literature and in life, you see the celebrated names and figures, the precious and much heralded men who are coming into prominence and are much talked about, the many benefactors of the age who know how to benefit mankind by making life easier and easier, some by railways, others by omnibuses and steamboats, others by telegraph, others by easily apprehended compendiums and short recitals of everything worth knowing, and finally the true benefactors of the age who make spiritual existence in virtue of thought easier and easier, yet more and more significant. And what are you doing? Here my soliloquy was interrupted, for my cigar was smoked out, and the new one had to be lit, so I smoked again, and then suddenly this thought flashed through my mind. You must do something, but inasmuch as with your limited capacities, it will be impossible to make anything easier than it has become. You must, with the same humanitarian enthusiasm as the others, undertake to make something harder. This notion pleased me immensely, and at the same time it flattered me to think that I, like the rest of them, would be loved and esteemed by the whole community. For there remains only one possible danger, namely, that the ease becomes so great that it becomes altogether too great. Then there is only one want left, though it is not yet a felt want, when people will want difficulty, out of love for mankind and out of despair at my embarrassing situation, seeing that I had accomplished nothing, and was unable to make anything easier than it had already been made, and moved by a genuine interest in those who make everything easy, I conceived it as my task to create difficulties everywhere. So then I am striving towards the exalted goal of being hailed with acclamation, unless possibly I am derided or maybe crucified, for it is quite certain that every man who shouts bravo shouts also Perrier, I don't know, if not crucify, and that even without being untrue to his character, since on the contrary he remains true to himself, qua shouter. But even though my efforts be misunderstood, I am convinced, nevertheless, that it is just as noble as that of the others. When at a banquet, where the guests have already overeaten, one person is concerned about bringing on new courses, another about having a vomitive at hand. It is perfectly true that only the first has interpreted correctly the requirement of the guests, but I wonder whether the other might not also say that he is concerned about what the requirement might be. 2. On his works. What does all this come to when the reader puts together the points dwelt upon in the foregoing paragraphs? It means that this is a literary work in which the whole thought is the task of becoming a Christian, but it is a literary work which understood from the very first and consistently followed out the implication of the fact that the situation is Christendom, a reflective modification, and hence transformed into a reflection all the relationships of Christianity. To become a Christian in Christendom means either to become what one is, the inwardness of reflection, or to become inward through reflection, or it means that the first thing is to be disengaged from the toils of one's illusion, which again is a reflective modification. Here there is no room for vacillation or ambiguity of the sort one commonly experiences elsewhere when one does not know and cannot make out whether one is situated in paganism, whether the parson is a missionary in that sense, or whereabouts one is. Here one does not miss what is generally lacking, vis-a-vis a decisive categorical definition and a decisive expression for the situation. To preach Christianity in Christendom, everything is put in terms of reflection. The communication is qualified by reflection, hence it is indirect communication. The communicator is characterized by reflection, therefore he is negative, not one who says that he himself is a Christian in an extraordinary degree, or even lays claim to revelations, all of which answers to immediacy and direct communication, but on the contrary, one who even affirms that he is not a Christian. That is to say, the communicator stands behind the other man, helping him negatively, for whether he actually succeeds in helping someone is another question. The problem itself is a problem of reflection, to become a Christian when one is a Christian of a sort. 3. On his mode of existence. The difference in my personal mode of existence corresponding to the essential difference in the works. In this age, and indeed for many ages past, people have quite lost sight of the fact that authorship is and ought to be a serious calling implying an appropriate mode of personal existence. They do not realize that the press in general, as an expression of the abstract and impersonal communication of ideas, and the daily press in particular, because of its formal indifference to the question whether what it reports is true or false, contributes enormously to the general demoralization, for the reason that the impersonal, which for the most part is irresponsible and incapable of repentance, is essentially demoralizing. They do not realize that anonymity, as the most absolute expression for the impersonal, the irresponsible, the unrepentant, is a fundamental source of the modern demoralization. On the other hand, they do not reflect that anonymity would be counteracted in the simplest possible way, and that a wholesome corrective would be furnished for the abstractness of printed communication, if people would but turn back again to antiquity and learn what it means to be a single individual man, neither more nor less, which surely even an author is to neither more nor less. This is perfectly obvious. But in our age, which reckons as wisdom that which is truly the mystery of unrighteousness, vis-a-vis that one need not inquire about the communicator, but only about the communication, the objective only. In our age, what is an author? An author is often merely an X. Even when his name is signed, something quite impersonal, which addresses itself abstractly by the aid of printing to thousands and thousands, while remaining itself unseen and unknown, living a life as hidden, as anonymous as it is possible for a life to be, in order presumably not to reveal too obvious and striking contradiction between the prodigious means of communication employed and the fact that the author is only a single individual, perhaps also for fear of the control which in practical life must always be exercised over everyone who wishes to teach others to see whether his personal existence comports with his communication. But all this, which deserves the most serious attention on the part of one who would study the demoralization of the modern state, all this I cannot enter into more particularly here. The personal mode of existence in relation to the aesthetic works. I come now to the first period of my authorship and my mode of existence. Here was a religious author, but one who began as an aesthetic author, and this first stage was one of incognito and deceit, initiated as I was very early and very thoroughly into the secret that mundus vult decepi. I was not in the position of being able to wish to follow such tactics. Quite the contrary. With me it was a question of deceiving inversely on the greatest possible scale, employing every bit of knowledge I had about men and their weaknesses and their stupidities, not to profit thereby, but to annihilate myself and weaken the impression I made. The secret of the deceit which suits the world which wants to be deceived consists partly in forming a coterie and all that goes with that, in joining one or another of those societies for mutual admiration whose members support one another with tongue and pen in the pursuit of worldly advantage, and it consists partly in hiding oneself from the human crowd, never being seen so as to produce a fantastic effect. So I had to do exactly the opposite. I had to exist in absolute isolation and guard my solitude, but at the same time take pains to be seen every hour of the day, living as it were upon the street, in company with Tom, Dick, and Harry, and in the most fortuitous situations. This is truth's way of deceiving, the everlasting sure way of weakening in a worldly sense the impression one makes. It was, moreover, the way followed by men of a very different caliber from mine to make people take notice. Those reputable persons, the deceivers who want the communication to serve them instead of serving the communication, are on the lookout only to win repute for themselves. Those despised persons, the witnesses for the truth, who deceive inversely, have ever been wont to suffer themselves to be set at naught in a worldly sense, and be counted as nothing, in spite of the fact that they labor day and night, and suffer besides from having no support whatever in the illusion that the work they perform is their career and their living. So this had to be done, and it was done, not now and then, but every day. I am convinced that 1/6 of either/or, together with a bit of coterie, and then an author who was never to be seen, especially if this was carried on for a considerable time, must make a much more extraordinary effect. I, however, had made myself sure of being able to work as laboriously as I pleased, and as the Spirit prompted me, without having to fear that I might get too much renown, for in a certain sense I was working as laboriously in another direction against myself. Only an author will be able to understand what a task it is to work qua author, i.e., with mind and pen, and yet be at the beck and call of everybody. Although this mode of existence enriched me immensely with observations of human life, it is a standard of conduct which would bring most men to despair, for it means the effort to dispel every illusion, and to present the idea in all its purity, and verily it is not truth that rides the world, but that rules the world, but illusions, even if a literary achievement were more illustrious than any that has yet been seen. If only the author were to live, as is here suggested, he would, in a brief time, have insured himself against worldly renown and the crowd's brutish adulation, for the crowd possesses no idealism, and hence no power of retaining impressions in spite of contrary appearances. It is always the victim of appearances, to be seen again and again, and to be seen in the most fortuitous situations is enough to make the crowd forget its first impression of the man, and become soon sick and tired of him. And, after all, to keep oneself perpetually in view does not consume a great deal of time, if only one employs one's time shrewdly, i.e., in a worldly sense insanely, and to the best effect by going back and forth past the same spot, and that the most frequented spot in the city. Everyone who husbands his reputation in a worldly sense will not return by the same way he went, and even if it is the most convenient way, he will avoid being seen twice in so short a time, for fear people might suppose he had nothing to do, whereas if he sat in his room at home 3/4 of the day and was idle, such a thought would never occur to anybody. On the other hand, an hour well spent, in a godly sense, an hour lived for eternity and spent by going back and forth among the common people is not such a small thing after all, and verily it is well pleasing to God that the truth should be served in this way. His Spirit witnesseth mightily with my spirit that it has the full consent of His divine majesty. All the witnesses of the truth indicate their approval, recognizing that one is disposed to serve the truth, the idea, and not to betray the truth and profit by the illusion. I experienced a real Christian satisfaction in venturing to perform on Monday a little bit of that which one weeps about on Sunday, when the parson prates about it and weeps too, and on Monday one is ready to laugh about. I had real Christian satisfaction in the thought that, if there were no other, there was definitely one man in Copenhagen whom every poor man could freely accost and converse with on the street, that if there were no other, there was one man who, whatever the society he more commonly frequented, did not shun contact with the poor, but greeted every maidservant. He was acquainted with every manservant, every common labourer. I felt a real Christian satisfaction in the fact that, if there were no other, there was one man who, several years before my existence, set the race another lesson to learn, made a practical effort on a small scale to learn the lesson of loving one's neighbour, and, alas, got at the same time a frightful insight into what an illusion Christendom is, and a little later, to be sure, an insight into what a situation the simpler classes suffer themselves to be seduced by paltry newspaper writers who struggle or fight for equality, since it is in the surface of a lie, cannot lead to any other result but to prompt the privileged class in self-defense to stand proudly aloof from the common man, and to make the common man insolent in his forwardness. The description of my personal existence cannot be carried out here in greater detail, but I am convinced that seldom has any author employed so much cunning, intrigue, and shrewdness to win honour and reputation in the world, with a view to deceiving it, as I displayed, in order to deceive it inversely, in the interest of truth. On how great a scale this was carried out I shall attempt to show by one single instance, known to my friend Kierkegaard, the proofreader of Either Or. I was so busy when I was reading the proofs of Either Or that it was impossible to spend the usual time sauntering back and forth on the street. I did not get through the work till late in the evening, and then I hastened to the theatre, where I remained literally only from 5 to 10 minutes. And why did I do this? Because I feared the big book would create for me too great a reputation. And why did I do this? Because I knew human nature, especially in Copenhagen, to be seen every night for 5 minutes by several hundred people sufficed to substantiate the opinion. He hasn't the least thing in the world to do. He is a mere idler. Such was the existence I led by way of seconding my aesthetic work. Incidentally, it involved a breach with all coteries, and I formed the polemical resolution to regard every eulogy as an attack, and every attack as a thing unworthy of notice. Such was my public mode of existence. I almost never made a visit, and at home the rule was strictly observed to receive no one except the poor who came to seek help, for I had no time to receive visitors at home, and anyone who entered my home as a visitor might easily get a presentiment of a situation about which he should have no presentiment. Thus I existed. If Copenhagen ever has been of one opinion about anybody, I venture to say that it was of one opinion about me, that I was an idler, a dawdler, a flaneur, a frivolous bird, intelligent, perhaps brilliant, witty, etc. But as for seriousness, I lacked it utterly. I represented a worldly irony, jeu de vivre, the subtlest form of pleasure-seeking without a trace of seriousness and positivity. On the other hand, I was prodigiously witty and interesting. When I look back upon that time, I am almost tempted to make some sort of apology to the people of importance and repute in the community, for true enough I knew perfectly well what I was doing, yet from their standpoint they were right in finding fault with me, because by thus impairing my own prestige I contributed to the movement which was impairing power and renown in general, notwithstanding that I have always been conservative in this respect, and have found joy in paying to the eminent and distinguished the deference, awe, and admiration which are due to them. Yet my conservative disposition did not involve a desire to have this sort of distinction for myself, and just because the eminent and distinguished members of the community have shown me in so many ways not only sympathy but partiality, have sought in so many ways to draw me to their side, which certainly was honest and well meant on their part, just for this reason I feel impelled to make them an apology, although naturally I cannot regret what I have done, since I served my idea. People of distinction have always proved more consistent in their treatment of me than the simpler classes, who even from their own standpoint did not behave rightly, since they too, according to the foregoing account, attacked me, because I was not superior enough to hold myself aloof, which is very queer and ridiculous of the simpler classes. This is the first period. By my personal mode of existence I endeavored to support the pseudonyms, the aesthetic work as a whole, melancholy, incurable melancholy as I was, suffering prodigious griefs in my inmost soul, having broken in desperation from the world and all that is of the world, strictly brought up from my very childhood in the apprehension that the truth must suffer and be mocked and derided, spending a definite time every day in prayer and devout meditation, and being myself personally a penitent, in short, being what I was, I found, I do not deny it, a certain sort of satisfaction in this life, in this inverse deception, a satisfaction in observing that the deception succeeded so extraordinarily that the public and I were on the most confidential terms, that I was quite in the fashion as the preacher of a gospel of worldliness, that though I was not in possession of the sort of distinction which can only be earned by an entirely different mode of life, yet in secret, and hence the more heartily loved, I was the darling of the public, regarded by everyone as prodigiously interesting and witty. This satisfaction, which was my secret, and which sometimes put me into an ecstasy, might have been a dangerous temptation, not as though the world and such things could tempt me with their flattery and adulation. No, on that side I was safe. if I was to have been capsized, it would have to have been by this thought raised to a higher power, an obsession almost of ecstasy at the thought of how the deception was succeeding. This was an indescribable alleviation to a sense of resentment which smoulders in me from my childhood, because long before I had seen it with my own eyes, I had been taught that falsehood, pettiness, and injustice ruled the world. I often had to think of these words in either or. If ye but knew what it is ye laugh at, if ye but knew what with whom ye have to do, who this flâneur is. Great, for that individual. There is a view of life which conceives that where the crowd is, there also is the truth, and that in truth itself there is need of having the crowd on its side. There is another view of life which conceives that wherever there is a crowd, there is untruth, so that, to consider for a moment the extreme case, even if every individual, each for himself in private, were to be in possession of the truth, yet in case they were all together in a crowd to which any sort of decisive significance is attributed, a voting, noisy, audible crowd, untruth would at once be in evidence. For a crowd is the untruth. In a godly sense it is true, eternally, Christianly, as St. Paul says, that only one attains the goal, which is not meant in a comparative sense, for comparison takes others into account. It means that every man can be that one, God helping him therein, but only one attains the goal. And again this means that every man should be chary about having to do with the others, and essentially should talk only with God and with himself, for only one attains the goal. And again this means that man, or to be a man, is akin to deity. In a worldly and temporal sense it will be said by the man of bustle, sociability, and amicableness, how unreasonable that only one attains the goal, for it is far more likely that many, by the strength of united effort, should attain the goal. And when we are many, success is more certain, and it is easier for each man severally. True enough, it is far more likely. And it is true also with respect to all earthly and material goods. If it is allowed to have its way, this becomes the only true point of view, for it does away with God and eternity and with man's kinship with deity. It does away with it, or it transforms it into a fable, and puts in its place the modern, or we might rather say the old pagan notion, that to be a man is to belong to a race endowed with reason, to belong to it as a specimen, so that the race or species is higher than the individual, which is to say that there are no more individuals, but only specimens, but eternity which arches over and high above the temporal, tranquil as the starry vault at night, and God in heaven, who in the bliss of that sublime tranquillity holds in survey without the least sense of dizziness at such a height these countless multitudes of men, and knows each single individual by name. He, the great examiner, says, and everyone, that only one attains the goal. That means everyone can, and everyone should be this one, but only one attains the goal. Hence, where there is a multitude, a crowd, or where decisive significance is attached to the fact that there is a multitude, there it is sure that no one is working, living, striving for the highest aim, but only for one or another earthly aim, since to work for the eternal decisive aim is possibly only where there is one. And to be this one which all can be is to let God be the helper. The crowd is the untruth. A crowd, not this crowd or that, the crowd now living or the crowd long deceased. A crowd of humble people or of superior people, of rich or of poor, etc. A crowd in its very concept is the untruth, by reason of the fact that it renders the individual completely impenitent and irresponsible, or at least weakens his sense of responsibility by reducing it to a fraction. Observe that there was not one single soldier that dared lay hands upon Caius Marius. This was an instance of truth, but given merely 3 or 4 women with the consciousness or the impression that they were a crowd, and with hope of a sort in the possibility that no one could say definitely who was doing it or who began it. Then they had courage for it. What a falsehood. The falsehood, first of all, is the notion that the crowd does what in fact only the individual in the crowd does, though it be every individual, for a crowd is an abstraction and has no hands, but each individual has ordinarily 2 hands, and so when an individual lays his 2 hands upon Caius Marius, they are the 2 hands of the individual, certainly not those of his neighbor, and still less those of the crowd, which has no hands. In the next place, the falsehood is that the crowd had the courage for it, for no one of the individuals was ever so cowardly as the crowd always is. For every individual who flees for refuge into the crowd, and so flees in cowardice from being an individual who had not the courage to lay his hands upon Caius Marius, nor even to attempt that he had it not, nor even to admit that he had it not, such a man contributes his share of cowardliness to the cowardliness which we know as the crowd. Take the highest example. Think of Christ and the whole human race, all the men that ever were born or are to be born, but let the situation be one that challenges the individual, requiring each one for himself to be alone with him in a solitary place, and as an individual to step up to him and spit upon him. The man was born and never will be born with courage or insolence enough to do such a thing. This is untruth. The crowd is untruth. Hence, none has more contempt for what it is to be a man than they who make it their profession to lead the crowd. Let someone approach a person of this sort, some individual that is an affair far too small for his attention, and he proudly repels him. There must be hundreds at the least, and when there are thousands, he defers to the crowd, bowing and scraping to them. What untruth! No, when it is a question of a single individual man, then is the time to give expression to the truth by showing one's respect for what it is to be a man, and if perhaps it was, as cruelty said, a poor wretch of a man, then the thing to do is to invite him into the best room, and one who possesses several voices should use the kindest and most friendly. That is truth. If, on the other hand, there were an assemblage of thousands or more, and the truth was to be decided by ballot, then this is what one should do, unless one were to prefer to utter silently the petition of the Lord's Prayer, deliver us from evil. One should, in godly fear, give expression to the fact that the crowd, regarded as a judge over ethical and religious matters, is untruth, whereas it is eternally true that every man can be the one. This is the truth. The crowd is untruth. Therefore was Christ crucified, because although he addressed himself to all, he would have no dealings with the crowd, because he would not permit the crowd to aid him in any way, because in this regard he repelled people absolutely, would not found a party, did not permit balloting, but would be what he is, the truth, which relates itself to the individual, and hence everyone who truly would serve the truth is eo ipso, in one way or another, a martyr. If it were possible for a person in his mother's womb to make the decision to will to serve the truth truly, then whatever his martyrdom turns out to be, he is eo ipso from his mother's womb, a martyr, for it is not so great a trick to win the crowd. All that is needed is some talent, a certain dose of falsehood, and a little acquaintance with human passions, but no witness for the truth, and that is what every man should be, including you and me. No witness for the truth, dare become engaged with the crowd, the witness for the truth who naturally has nothing to do with politics and must above everything else be most vigilantly on the watch not to be confounded with the politician. The God-fearing work of the witness to the truth is to engage himself, if possible, with all, but always individually, talking to everyone severally on the streets and lanes, in order to disintegrate the crowd, or to talk even to the crowd, though not with the intent of educating the crowd as such, but rather with the hope that one or another individual might return from this assemblage and become a single individual. On the other hand, the crowd, when it is treated as an authority and its judgment regarded as the final judgment, is detested by the witness for the truth more heartily than a maiden of good morals detests the public dance floor, and he who addresses the crowd as the supreme authority is regarded by him as the tool of the untruth. For, to repeat what I have said, that which in politics or in similar fields may be justifiable, wholly or in part, becomes the untruth when it is transferred to the intellectual, the spiritual, the religious fields. And one thing more I would say, perhaps with a cautiousness which is exaggerated. By truth, I mean always eternal truth. But politics, etc., have nothing to do with eternal truth. A policy which is in the proper sense of eternal truth were to make serious work of introducing eternal truth into real life, would show itself in that very same second to be in the most eminent degree the most impolitic thing that can be imagined. A crowd is untruth, and I could weep, or at least I could learn to long for eternity, at thinking of the misery of our age in comparison even with the greatest misery of bygone ages, owing to the fact that the daily press with its anonymity makes the situation matter still with the help of the public, this abstraction which claims to be the judge in matters of truth. For in reality assemblies which make this claim do not now take place. The fact that an anonymous author, by the help of the press, can day by day find occasion to say, even about intellectual, moral, and religious matters, whatever he pleases to say, and what perhaps he would be very far from having the courage to say as an individual, that every time he opens his mouth, or shall we say his abysmal gullet, he at once is addressing thousands of thousands, that he can get 10,000 times 10,000 to repeat after him what he has said, and with all this nobody has any responsibility, so that it is not, as in the ancient times, the relatively unrepentant crowd which possesses omnipotence, but the absolutely unrepentant thing, a nobody, an anonymity, who is the producer, aucteur, and another anonymity, the public, sometimes even anonymous subscribers, and with all this, nobody, good God! And yet our states call themselves Christian states. Let no one say that in this case it is possible for truth in its turn by the help of the press to get the better of lies and errors. O thou who speakest thus, dost thou venture to maintain that men regarded as a crowd are just as quick to seize upon the truth which is not always palatable as upon falsehood which always is prepared delicately to give delight, not to mention the fact that acceptance of the truth is made the more difficult by the necessity of admitting that one has been deceived? Or dost thou venture even to maintain that truth can just as quickly be understood as falsehood, which requires no preliminary knowledge, no schooling, no discipline, no abstinence, no self-denial, no honest concern about oneself, no patient labor? Nay, truly, which abhors also this untruth of aspiring after broad dissemination as the one aim, is not nimble on its feet. In the first place, it cannot work by means of the fantastical means of the press, which is the untruth. The communicator of the truth can only be a single individual, and again the communication of it can only be addressed to the individual, for the truth consists precisely in that conception of life which is expressed by the individual. The truth can neither be communicated nor received except as it were under God's eyes, not without God's help, not without God's being involved as the middle term, he himself being the truth. It can therefore only be communicated by and received by the individual, which, as a matter of fact, can be every living man. The mark which distinguishes such a man is merely that of the truth, in contrast to the abstract, the fantastical, the impersonal, the crowd, the public, which excludes God as the middle term, for the personal God cannot be a middle term in an impersonal relationship, and therefore and thereby excludes also the truth, for God is at once the truth and the middle term which renders it intelligible. And to honor every man, absolutely every man, is the truth, and this is what it is to fear God and love one's neighbor. But from an ethico-religious point of view, to recognize the crowd as the court of last resort is to deny God, and it cannot exactly mean to love the neighbor. And the neighbor is the absolutely true expression for human equality. In case everyone were in case everyone were in truth to love his neighbor as himself, complete human equality would be attained. Everyone who loves his neighbor in truth expresses unconditionally human equality. Everyone who, like me, admits that his effort is weak and imperfect, yet is aware that the task is to love one's neighbor, is also aware of what human equality is. But never have I read in Holy Scripture the commandment, "Thou shalt love the crowd," and still less supreme authority in matters of truth. And still less thou shalt recognize ethico-religiously in the crowd the supreme authority in matters of, quote, truth. But the thing is simple enough. This thing of loving one's neighbor is self-denial. That of loving the crowd, or pretending to love it, of making it the authority in matters of the truth, is the way to material power, the way to temporal and earthly advantages of all sorts. At the same time, it is the untruth, for a crowd is the untruth. But he who acknowledges the truth of his view, which is seldom presented, for it often happens that a man thinks that the crowd is the untruth, but when the crowd, accepts his opinion in mass, everything is all right again, admits for himself that he is weak and impotent, for how could it be possible for an individual to make a stand against the crowd which possesses the power? And he could not wish to get the crowd on his side for the sake of ensuring that his view would prevail, the crowd, ethico-religiously regarded, being the untruth. That would be mocking himself. But although, from the first, this view involves an admission of weakness and impotence, and seems therefore far from inviting, and for this reason perhaps is so seldom heard, yet it has the good feature that it is even-handed, that it offends no one, not a single person, that it makes no invidious distinctions, not the least in the world. The crowd, in fact, is composed of individuals. It must, therefore, be in every man's power to become what he is, an individual. From becoming an individual, no one at all is excluded, except he who excludes himself by becoming a crowd. To become a crowd, to collect a crowd about one, is on the contrary to affirm the distinctions of human life. The most well-meaning person who talks about these distinctions can easily offend an individual, but then it is not the crowd which possesses power, influence, repute, and mastery over men, but it is the invidious distinctions of human life which despotically ignore the single individual as the weak and impotent, which in a temporal and worldly interest ignore the eternal truth, the single individual. The individual is the category through which, in a religious respect, this age, all history, the human race as a whole, must pass, and he who stood at Thermopylae was not so secure in his position as I who have stood in defense of this narrow defile, the individual, with the intent at least of making people take notice of it. His duty was to prevent the hosts from pressing through the defile. If they pressed through, he was lost. My task is one which at least does not expose me to any such danger of being trampled underfoot, for my task was as a humble servant, yet, as I have said from the beginning, and repeated again and again, without authority, to provoke, if possible, to invite, to stir up the many to press through this defile of the individual, through which, however, no one can pass except by becoming the individual, the contrary being a categorical impossibility. And yet, if I were to desire an inscription for my tombstone, I should desire none other than that individual. If that is not now understood, it surely will be. The pseudonyms in their time, when here at home all the talk was about system, always system, aimed a blow at the system with the category of the individual. Now one hardly hears the system any more mentioned, not at least as the last word of fashion, and as the requirement of the age. I marked the beginning of the literary production over my own name by the category of the individual, and that remained as a stereotyped formula, showing me that this thing of the individual is not a later invention of mine, but my first thought. With the category of the individual is bound up any ethical importance I may have. If that category was right, if that category was in place, if I saw rightly at this point and understood rightly that it was my task, certainly not a pleasant nor a thankful one, to call attention to it, if that was the task given me to do, albeit with inward suffering such as certainly are seldom experienced, and without outward sacrifices such as man is not every day found willing to make, in that case I stand fast, and my works with me.